It begins when we are children on the playground. We sort ourselves into teams, into the cool kids and the losers, into us and them. We want to know who is in and who is out, who is really on our side. It's fascinating how much energy children devote to this. And it doesn't stop when we grow up. As adults, we look for our tribe when we move to a new place or start a new job. We check out yard signs and bumper stickers to find out which tribe our neighbors are in. We gravitate to those we agree with, and we're more standoffish and reserved with those we don't. Probably it traces back millions of years, to the time when our tribe meant safety and survival, and other tribes meant danger. There is something deep within human nature that wants to divide everyone into two categories, us and them. It's unusual for all three of our readings to converge on a single theme. Indulge me in my church nerdery for a moment. The Revised Common Lectionary sets a cycle of readings that takes us through most of the Bible over the course of 3 years. We spend 1 year on each of the 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, with John's Gospel interspersed among the others. The Old Testament reading is chosen for thematic similarity to the Gospel of the day. There's supposed to be a resonance between them. But we hear the New Testament letters more or less continuously. We started Paul's letter to the Romans back in June. We're reading it mostly from start to finish, and when we're done, we'll move on to another of Paul's letters. The New Testament reading tends to stand apart from the Old Testament and the Gospel. Most preachers, including me, choose to focus on either the Gospel plus Old Testament or the New Testament letter. It's difficult to get a coherent, unified message out of readings that don't really go together. But when all 3 readings point to the same topic, it's like God has set up a flashing neon sign saying, "Look here." And that's where we are today with this question of who really belongs. Who is us and who is them? 3 prophets use the name Isaiah in ancient Israel. They're called, creatively, 1st Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, and 3rd Isaiah. 3rd Isaiah is the latest of the 3. He's writing at the end of Israel's worst catastrophe, its conquest by the Babylonian Empire and the exile of its people. After 40 years, the exiles are finally coming home, but their time in exile has changed them, and it's changed how they understand their relationship with God. Long ago, their ancestor Abraham made a covenant with God. He promised that he and his descendants would be God's people, and God would be their God. Israel has spent hundreds of years working out how to worship and live as God's people. Religious identity for ancient Israel and all ancient people is a matter of ethnicity. If you are an Israelite, you're one of God's people. If you're from some other nation, you stand outside the covenant. The Babylonian exile is the first time in a very long time that large numbers of Israelites have lived among other peoples. Some of the Babylonians have witnessed the Israelites' way of life, their worship, and these foreigners are drawn to God. They can't be Israelites. They're Babylonians. But could they too be part of God's people? 3rd Isaiah says, yes. As long as these foreigners join to God instead of other gods, as long as they worship and serve God, keep the Sabbath as described in Israelite law, and hold fast to the covenant, they too are God's people. The ethnic differences don't disappear. These Babylonians are still Babylonians. But those divisions pale in the unity of all God's people in, with, and through God. Before the exile, the temple was the house of prayer for Israel. Now it is a house of prayer for all peoples. As God has gathered up the exiles, God will gather other peoples of the world. God will accept their offerings, and all peoples will be joyful in God's house. For 3rd Isaiah, there is no them. There is only us. But when God sends Jesus, and some Jews accept him as the Messiah and some do not, Has God rejected Israel? And when many Gentiles turn to Jesus, who is in and who is out now? That's the context of the Apostle Paul. Paul, like Jesus and all the first disciples, is Jewish, but he receives a call to share the gospel with Gentiles. He's wildly successful, so successful that within a few decades of Jesus' death and resurrection, Christianity is mostly a Gentile movement. Many of these Gentile Christians, like those in Rome, live in predominantly Jewish communities that include Jewish Christians and Jewish non-Christians. The Gentiles are asking, since we're in, does that mean Jews who don't follow Jesus are out? Paul says, no. God has not rejected God's people. The gifts and call of God are irrevocable. God's covenant with Israel still holds. Paul, as a Jew, is part of that covenant. Paul works this out in several chapters of the letter to the Romans, and where he lands is that Gentile Christians are redeemed with Jews. Paul believed the return of Jesus was imminent, maybe next week, maybe next year, but soon. Paul and others were working to bring the nations, the Gentile nations, to the gospel, so that when Jesus returned, all nations, Jewish and Gentile, would share in the redemption God promised to the Jews. Again, the ethnic differences between nations don't disappear. But beyond the them of this transient world, there is an us that embraces all God's people from every nation. This is a lesson that Jesus himself is maybe still learning. There's a lot about this episode that doesn't make sense to me, beginning with Jesus going to Tyre and Sidon. He has been on the Sea of Galilee, a Jewish region 50 miles inland. Then he goes to Tyre and Sidon, a Gentile region on the Mediterranean coast. It's not clear from Matthew's account why Jesus is there. Jesus has said explicitly that his mission is only to Jews, to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He has sent his disciples to other Jews. So what is he doing in a Gentile town? For whatever reason, there Jesus is. He is now the foreigner, the minority. A Canaanite woman, a Gentile, comes out of her home and shouts at Jesus to have mercy on her. She uses a Jewish title, Son of David. She recognizes Jesus as the Messiah. She pleads for him to heal her daughter. Jesus doesn't answer her at all. She persists, and she gets the disciples' attention. She bothers the disciples enough that they ask Jesus to get rid of her, move her along. Jesus tries to dissuade her, but she kneels at his feet and asks, "Help me." Jesus insults her, calls her a dog, but she pushes back. She has heard about Jesus, and she knows that with Jesus, there is more than enough for everyone. There's enough yeast to leaven 60 pounds of flour. There's enough bread and fish to feed thousands of people. There is enough mercy and healing for her and her daughter. And Jesus changes his mind. He heals this woman's child. This is a turning point for Jesus. From now on, he seems to take the message of 3rd Isaiah to heart. This Canaanite woman is a Gentile, yes, but there is enough for her and her people. They will never be ethnically Jews. Those differences are still there. But they too are God's people. The next time Jesus sends the disciples out to preach the good news, he sends them to all nations, Gentiles as well as Jews. It's a critical expansion of Jesus' mission. It moves Jesus and all of his movement away from them towards an expansive us that embraces all. I cannot explain why Jesus responds to this woman with silence and insults. His treatment of her seems completely opposed to everything I know Jesus to be. Yet, maybe it's comforting to know that even Jesus struggles with this very human desire to have a them and an us. Everybody struggles with this. Everybody. We are not the only ones. And Jesus changing his mind and healing this woman's daughter is comforting too. We don't have to accept the tribal divisions our nature and our culture try to force on us. We too can change. We too can move towards that expansive us. The politics of division are powerful forces, especially now. Yet the sacred stories of our faith show us another world, where differences are real and all people are God's people. The things that divide us pale in the unity of all people in, with, and through God. In God's eyes, there is never any them. There is only ever us.